I started in the game industry about 20 years ago, working primarily on flight simulators. I then worked on some sports simulators and multiplayer, massively multiplayer online games before moving into mobile. So I've been with Amazon now for about 3 years, and one of the big questions I get is Amazon and games. What's the connection? So many of you may have heard of Amazon Web Services, and it turns out that most game developers are actually using Amazon Web Services in some way or other. In fact, I think there was analysis done last year, and that number was about 55% of all game developers are using Amazon. So it turns out that Amazon actually tries to support our customers as best we can, whether they're consumers or developer customers, and so we provide the developers with lots of services like distribution services, monetization services, and then of course we have lots of support services that allow you to fine-tune your applications and drive engagement. What I wanted to talk about today, though, was some of the information that we've gleaned from the millions and millions of downloads and in-app purchase transactions that we deal with every year as an application publisher. It exposes a lot of interesting statistics. Maybe the first is not so surprising. It's that IAP adoption is on the rise. It's definitely mainstream now. I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. We don't have the numbers for 2014 yet, but I expect this to be significantly higher than last year. What's interesting, though, about this is that while IAP is growing steadily year after year, what we noticed is that it tends to be growing faster for a certain select group of top developers. So, of course, it begs the question, what are those top developers doing differently from everyone else? We had a couple ideas, but it turns out that it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what the underlying function is that they might be applying. So what we did is we turned to cohort analysis, which is a way to look at a bunch of data based on behavior of specific groups of people or cohorts. They're typically related to a shared experience, could be for a specific time period, and some examples might be people who have had measles at a certain age, or people with a specific physical attribute who have a specific job during a specific time. But of course, in our case, we might be looking for something a little more apropos. So customers, for instance, who have upgraded their purchase within 1 week of a previous purchase. So for our test, for this analysis, we actually generated 2 different cohorts. We looked at customers who installed a freemium game last summer and split those customers into 2 different populations. The first, or cohort 1, was all the people who had purchased one of these top 50 games, an app from one of these top 50 monetizing developers. And then, of course, the second cohort was everyone who'd purchased an app not in that category. Highest grossing per customer. I'm not sure I understand the question. Oh, I see. This would be highest ARPU, so average revenue per user. And we actually normalize this data by removing, say, casino games, because that would drastically throw off our results, and they're kind of in a category by themselves. But this graph actually illustrates our first hypothesis, which was maybe there's some relationship between the number of active users compared to the number of installations between the top 50 and the rest of the developers. So this graph shows the number of installed users over time, over about 30 days, normalized to 100. And you can see the blue graph is the number of active users. So you can see that installations don't fall off quite as fast as the activity, which means that even after 30 days, there's a high percentage of users who keep the applications on their phone or their tablet. but of course activity decreases over time. So our hypothesis was that obviously these guys probably have a much higher installed base and some perhaps more active users over time than the rest of the developers. So let's look at this data for the rest. Did you see any difference? There's a tiny little dip there in that it's true that if you're not one of the top 50 developers, you do have a slightly higher chance of being uninstalled after 30 days. But it's really not that big a deal. And you notice that the activity, is actually almost identical between the two. So clearly, the number of installations and uninstallations is not a good predictor of whether you're going to be in the top 50 grossing apps or not. So then we looked at the rest, some other data to see it from a different perspective. We hypothesized that, well, perhaps it's the overall session time, which stands to reason, right? You're talking about engagement. So the higher engagement would probably lead to higher monetization. And we do see right away that there seems to be a correlation here. So the blue is the top 50, the orange is everybody else, and you can see that the average session length, this big pie in the center, is slightly longer for the top 50. Strangely, the number of sessions is actually greater for everybody else, but the longer session length outweighs that over time. So on day 0, which is the day of installation, we see an immediate weight towards the top 50 over the rest of the developers for overall session length and count. 1 day later, this is starting to increase. We're widening the gap just a little bit. After 3 days, you can see there's a slight decrease in total session time. So that's illustrating the fact that activity tends to decrease over time. But you can see that the average session length for the top 50 is starting to outstrip even more the rest of the games. You see the number of sessions still, for some reason, is favoring the rest. So clearly, the session length is more important, at least in our analysis, than the session count. 1 week later, total session time is basically double for the top 50 over the rest. 2 weeks later, it's just continuing to outstrip, growing, and by 30 days, you can see the rest is still in the game. They're getting their application traffic. People are coming back because the number of sessions is still high. But for some reason, they can't seem to monetize those visits, and perhaps that's because they're not keeping them there very long. So then we thought we'd take a look at a different set of revenue and different set of information that we have, which is the sales and revenue. So for this analysis, we normalized the rest at 100%, and we can see that immediately that the blue bars for the top 50 are higher in both cases, both the number of items that they're paying for and the average selling price for those items. So for some reason, the average selling price in the top 50 is 41% higher than the other games. And this, coupled with a slight advantage in the number of items they're actually selling, leads to a 54% premium over the rest of the games. That's on day 1, day 0, day of installation. On day 1, this just grows even more. So now we're looking at an average selling price 52% higher. 3 days later, now it's almost double. So the total RPPU, which is the average revenue per paying user, is 93% higher than the rest. After 1 week, I mean, this is crazy, right? 261% of the baseline for the rest. What exactly are they doing here? They're basically making 2.5 times as much as everyone else. So actually, this outstrips even the session time distribution that we talked about before. So this is 2.5 times the revenue, and the session is only about 2/3. 2 weeks later, this is the first time that the RPPU has actually started to slide back. So from that enormous 261%, now we're back to 226. and after 30 days, we've settled down to only 219% of revenue compared to the rest. So there's something going on here. So this is a great question. He's asking if, when doing the analysis, we look at all the average prices across the catalogs in these applications. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm gonna talk about that very shortly. But the initial analysis, actually, I'm gonna talk about it right now. That's how shortly it is. So I just wanted to kind of throw this up here to show the relative distribution of the price points that people are offering in their games and the corresponding contribution to total revenue. So the orange bar shows the relative preponderance of items in a particular price point. So you can see that at the 99 cent level, 22% of all catalog items are in that price. So fully a fifth of all items are priced at 99 cents. Next most popular is the $4.99 and then $1.99. And you can see, even though we eliminated some, well, all casino games, there are some games that actually sell items, in-app purchase items, for $99. Now, why this graph is interesting to me is because the blue bars represent the actual contribution toward total revenue of each of these price points. And even though a fifth of all items are 99 cents, they only account for 6% of total revenue. Whereas the 1999 items only account for 6% of the catalog, but they actually contribute 20% of the total revenue. So this is for all applications, regardless of whether they're in the top 50 or not. We actually factored out the top 50 so we could look at them separately. And what you might notice right away is that the delta now between the orange and the blue is much smaller for the top 50. And what this tells us is that the top 50 are doing a much better job at balancing the availability of the higher priced items. So they know, for instance, that the $20 value is going to generate most of their revenue, and so they actually devote more catalog space to those items. There's some discrepancy still, but considering we think this is fairly organic, we're not expecting them to have done this analysis across millions of transactions and hundreds of thousands of apps. So they're actually doing a pretty good job of just kind of doing this by feel. So what we've discovered here is that there are two primary needle movers with respect to revenue generation. Number one is session length, not necessarily session count, but keeping them longer rather than more often, and having a higher priced in-app purchase item in your catalog. So in the previous slides, I was showing you normalized data. I wanted to show you something that wasn't necessarily adjusted quite so heavily. This is just illustrating the activity over time for a typical app. And this data hasn't really changed for several years, every year that we've run this analysis. And I just wanted to take this time to illustrate again that the beginning of the life cycle, or the initial publishing act, is a critical time to take advantage of your customers with regard to monetization, because this is when they're going to be most active. So time is money. It turns out timing is even more money, in part because, as you just saw, that you need to engage your customers early. 18% of all your customers' value is actually recognized on the very first day. Almost half of all purchases happen within 1 hour of another purchase. So again, the engagement, keeping them in longer, works to your advantage. And then you also want to give them a reason to come back, because more than 50% of all purchases are repeat purchases. Almost 2/3 happen after the first week. So despite that drop-off in activity, you still have a long tail of potential earnings. And almost 1/3, or more than 1/3, actually happens after the first 30 days. So there are a couple things that we determined based on our analysis. Number one, selection drives repeat orders. So there doesn't seem to be an upper limit here. The more items that you can put in your app store, the more revenue you'll generate. Actually, 2% of all your customers generate just 30% of your sales. So it makes sense to continue to add items to your catalog to encourage them to come back. And then also, this is one of my favorite slides. Over time, your best customers become much less price sensitive. So in the early days of your installation, they're paying, say, 100% for a particular item. After 30 days, they're willing to pay about 60% more for each purchase. And this just makes sense, right? Because you know, after you've been playing a game for a while, that you just may need 3 gems instead of 1 to really get anywhere in your game. So you're willing to pay for the $4.99 item instead of the 99-cent item. This isn't necessarily true when you first install because it's an experiment, right? You've never played the game before. So there were a couple lessons we learned from this. Primarily, I don't think this is news to anyone, keep users engaged. You can use services like Game Circle, of course, because that's from Amazon. I have to talk about it. You can give some kind of player love. You can give direct device notifications to encourage them to come back. We found that if you increase the number, if you make some kind of tutorial available showing people how to purchase, you can drastically increase your conversion rate. It also helps to have some kind of post-purchase tutorial showing them how to use the things that they've purchased. Drives up your conversion rate quite a bit. And then having a clear and simple catalog that makes it easy for them to distinguish the value between the items. And also maybe search by along different axes. So whether they're looking for something that's an upgrade or something that will give them a specific power-up, for instance. It's really important that while you provide lots of variety in your catalog, you don't necessarily overwhelm the users with a variety of price points. So we found there's a sweet spot somewhere between 6 and 10. If you have 1 to 5 price points, then typically people aren't sure exactly what the distinction is between the items. If they're more than that, they tend to get confused by the distinctions. So you want to have a large number of items, but a small number of price points. And then we also found in speaking to our customers and speaking to our developer customers that localization plays a primary role in positive conversion. And so PlayerX, for instance, as a case study, looked at which territories they were localizing for. That was a critical step. Choosing a good title that translated well and making sure that they provided all their translators with lots of context so that they could make intelligent decisions themselves without a lot of input. And then obviously quality localization makes a big difference, and in fact bad localization is much, much worse than no localization. Similarly, another localization story, Playtales found that providing multilingual content, so not just localizing the app but actually localizing the content, had a significant effect. Using native speakers whenever they could obviously was critical to them, and they actually used they were able to monitor currency conversion rates and adjust their prices accordingly, take advantage of differences in currency conversion. And they also provided tech support in the native language, which increased their monetization of each customer. We also suggest that you take advantage of innovations within IAP. So IAP is obviously accepted and very commonplace now. There are things that are coming out that are pushing the technology. So for instance, Amazon, I am from Amazon, I have to talk about this stuff, offers in-app purchase of physical items, which is kind of cool. And then also mobile ads. So, you know, this graph shows projected growth for 2014. I think it's going to hit somewhere around 16 billion. That's in the next 2 or 3 years. I think we're going to hit an 8-fold increase overall from 2011, which is significant. So, not everybody's up for mobile ads. They're not always appropriate for your application, but if they are, you should definitely take advantage of them. We found, just practically speaking, that if you make banner ads, for instance, full width compared to, that's on the right, compared to that small banner ad on the left, you can actually increase your conversion by about 200%. So, our observations, obviously, IP, very common, very accepted. We found that longer sessions actually characterize the top monetizers, and that players will have no trouble paying for higher priced items. They become price insensitive over time. Balanced catalogs provide better conversion than kind of random catalogs, and obviously repeat customers are critical because the long tail is what's the long tail of your key customers, the 2% at the top, are actually generating most of your revenue, and that we found that the selection, the greater selection, the more you'll tend to make. Mobile ads, I just threw that in there because everybody knows we're moving on to mobile ads. Best practices as far as in-app purchase, just include it. You want to keep your customers engaged using a variety of different means. Teach them how to purchase, teach them how to consume, make your catalog simple and attractive so they can use it easily, and then offer a wide variety of items, updated frequently in a limited set of price points, and make those price points appropriate to demand, so make sure you balance your catalog. As far as localization, I think I'll just call out one, which is bad localization is much, much worse than no localization. I don't think anybody in this room is concerned about localizing, but when you do, make sure you do a good job. And then as far as future trends, try physical goods in your in-app purchase, use multiple ad networks, and just practically speaking, make your banners nice and big. That's it. I think the key takeaway here is that users don't spend money on apps, they spend money in apps, and the more they're in the game, the more they're going to spend. I've shared a few strategies I think that represent some of the key differentiators of the top 50 app developers on our catalog and the rest of the group. So please do follow us, and I think we have just maybe 1 or 2 minutes for a quick question.
Yeah, we have 1 or 2 minutes for questions. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand, and yeah, there's a mic that will come to you.
Hey, you guys obviously have in-house a lot of experience with dynamic pricings. Did you look at making the full in-game catalog also dynamic and so on?
No, because we don't actually control the in-app pricing for all the third-party applications that we analyzed.
So you didn't run any test runs or whatever with that?
We don't really have any insight into, how people are dynamically changing their catalog pricing right now.
Any ideas from the experiences on the Amazon shop how that might go?
Well, I think we give a lot of advice around data analytics, and so we tend to encourage people to use A/B testing, for instance, to try out different scenarios within their app, not necessarily to change the prices dynamically, because there are some legal ramifications of using testing for that purpose, but just doing data analysis across your user segments gives you a lot of insight into what's working and what isn't. We don't have any kind of analysis packaging that works with dynamic pricing right now.
Okay, so wrapping up the Q&A. So Peter will be around. You can approach him if you have more questions. And thank you.
Thank you.